Hi. Okay. Let's go on. Chapter 8. We have moved from the fall into the winter. Brian's Winter by Gary Paulson. Chapter 8. He awakened when he had slept enough and looked out of the shelter by cracking the door. It was cold and low and gray and raining, a dismal rain much like the one that had lasted so long earlier in the fall. And he kindled the fire with dry wood he'd set aside the night before when he'd seen the clouds moving in. Soon the inside of the shelter was cheery and warm, the smoke working its way out of the hole at the top, and he wished he'd thought to bring water in the night before, and also wished he didn't have to do what he had to do now. But he couldn't fight it, and at last he pulled himself out of the bag, grabbed the hatchet and the largest aluminum pot, and plunged out into the rain. As fast as possible, standing barefoot on the freezing wet ground, he went to the bathroom and then ran to the lake and chopped his watering hole open. It had frozen thinly overnight and filled the pan and ran back to the shelter. He slid the door back in place and put the pot on the fire and dropped a piece of venison into it to make a breakfast stew. The meat was getting low. He had stretched the wolf-killed doe as far as he could, trying to ration it and eat smaller amounts, but he'd have to hunt within 4 or 5 days. He put a piece of meat outside the door for Betty, surprised that she wasn't there already, and leaned back to think. In the past few days it had become colder. The weather had a kind of steady feel to it, as if it was not going to get warmer but would stay cold. He had to face some truths. He simply wasn't ready for cold weather. Oh, he thought the shelter was all right and the woods were full of fuel. But his clothing was pitiful. His jeans were holding together just. But his tennis shoes were about gone, his socks long since used to shreds, and on top all he had was a t-shirt, also nearly in pieces, and the rabbit skin vest. I am, he thought, a mess. He was tempted to smile, except that it wasn't really funny. He could sit in the shelter and stay warm, but unless he could hunt, he would die. And he couldn't hunt unless he had something to wear to keep from freezing. To death, he thought, the truth sliding in like a snake. I could freeze to death. Not quite yet. It wasn't that cold yet, but soon. He didn't know northern winters, but he knew it would get cold enough to kill him and freeze him solid. He took stock again. No clothing, although he still had some rabbit hides which he could sew into sleeves for his vest. There was also the hide from the doe. He looked at it and thought he might get a pair of moccasins out of it. They would be crude, but if he stitched them with the hair on the inside and made them big enough to wear over his tattered tennis shoes, they would help. He set to work on what he could do and spent all of that day sewing the rest of the rabbit skins into 2 tubes, which he attached as sleeves to the vest. When he tried it on, everything crackled as if he was wearing paper, but it seemed to hold together, and he slept that night feeling slightly better about his future. The next morning he checked the weather. Still raining and colder than it had been the previous morning, and then set to work making footwear. Foot gear. It proved both easier and harder than he had thought it would be. The easy part was making a pattern. He just stood on the dry skin and marked around his foot with a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. When he cut out the 2 bottoms, he cut the 2 rectangles from the remaining hide and stitched, with some effort, as the hide was thick and tough, the 2 pieces into rough cylinders. Then he sewed each of the tubes down to the sole, attaching it all around the edge, and when he was done, he had 2 chunky boots that he could stick his tennis shoes down into. With the hair on the inside, they felt warm the minute he stuck his feet into them. He used the last bits of hide to cut 2 strips to use for lacing to pull the tops of the cylinders tight to his legs. They hit about mid-calf, and it was here he learned how to soften leather. The deer hide was dried, and working with it was about like working with thin wood. It had no give and was brittle and hard and very, very tough. It was all he could do to sew the cylinders to the bottom using thin cut hide for lacing and punching holes with the tip of the knife. But the two straps that went around the top had to be soft enough to tie off. He thought of using the fishing line for thread, but didn't want to waste it. Then he found that by working the leather, first between his fingers, and then by pulling it over a piece of wood that stuck out of the wall, he could soften it. It never got truly soft and supple like tanned deer hide, but it was workable and got the job done. He gathered more wood just before dark and went to sleep that night dreaming of punching holes in leather with the tip of the knife. The image burned into his mind from sitting all day sewing. Sometime that night, near the middle, it grew quiet, and the change awakened him. He listened for a time and realized that the rain had stopped, and he snuggled back in the bag, thinking that with no rain the next day, he would hunt. In the morning he awakened and knew instantly that something had changed. Something about the sound. No, the lack of it. There was no sound. Normally he could hear birds in the morning or the wind rustling. Now there was nothing. He crawled out of the bed and opened the door of the shelter. Or tried to. It seemed to be stuck, frozen in place. He pushed harder and finally half stood, crouched, and pushed out with his shoulder against the door. At first, it still didn't move, and only when he crouched back and slammed into it with his shoulder did the door fall away, letting him look outside. It nearly blinded him. The entire world was white. Bright white, with new morning sun glaring off and through it, and so intense that it made his temples hurt. The snow had fallen in the night. Soft, large flakes, nearly 4 inches deep everywhere, on limbs, logs, the ground, on the lake ice, all over, and even 4 inches. And it was cold. Colder than it had been so far. His nostril hairs seemed to stick together when he breathed, and the air caught in his throat. The world was so incredibly, wonderfully, stunningly beautiful that for a full minute all he could do was stare. Oh. He had seen pictures of the woods with snow, and had seen snow in the park and in the city. But this was different. He was in it, inside the snowy scene, and the beauty of it became part of him. He stepped outside the shelter, and as he stepped into the snow, realized that he was barefoot. He jumped back inside and put on his tennis shoes and fur boots and the rabbit skin shirt and moved back outside. He had never seen anything so clean. Because it was all new there. Because it was all new, there wasn't a mark, not a track in the surface of the snow. And he took 4 or 5 paces just to look back at his tracks. "It's like a Bigfoot," he said aloud, and indeed the boots left a large, rounded hole for a footprint. He moved around, did his toilet, drawing a picture in the snow when he did, and was amazed how well the boots worked. kept his feet warm and comfortable. As he came close to the shelter, he saw a mouse appear almost magically out of the snow, run across the surface for 3 feet, and then dive under again. Brian moved to where the mouse had run and studied its tracks. Little dots in a parallel line, with a small line in the middle where the tail dragged. But clean, he thought, and neat, and so easy to see and follow, and everything that moved in the woods would leave tracks, would be easy to see, would be easy to follow, would be much easier to hunt. He still had some venison left, but he decided to hunt, because the snow was new and he'd never hunted in snow, because the sun was bright and fresh, because his clothing seemed to work. He decided to hunt, and it was in this way that he found the moose. Chapter 9. He prepared for hunting by putting his hatchet and knife on his belt and one of the butane lighters in his pocket. He started to take the light bow, but thought that he might see something big and want to take a shot, and so he took the war bow under the theory that he could shoot something small with the big bow, but he couldn't shoot a deer with a small bow. So he took the large bow and the new lance and 5 arrows with stone points and went hunting. At the start, he almost couldn't hunt. The woods were so beautiful, so changed. It was a whole different world that he walked slowly along and feasted his eyes on first one scene and then another. It should all be framed, he thought, framed in some way to take back. Take back. He hadn't thought that in a long while either. Pictures of home were fading, but if he could show this to his mother, he thought, just for her to see this. He shook his head and almost at the same instant saw a rabbit. It was sitting under an overhanging evergreen limb back in the shadow, but still very easy to see because it was brown. On its back there were several white spots, each about as large as a silver dollar. Brian had seen several rabbits with similar white spots and had thought they were some kind of fluke or mutation. But he guessed now that they actually changed color in the winter and became white so that they wouldn't be so visible. Without it, Brian thought they were dead meat. A week or so earlier, he had walked through and seen 1 rabbit in this area. He now took 20 steps and saw 7, all at varying ranges, none close enough to shoot, all standing out like sore thumbs because they were brown against the white snow. He moved easily, slowly, waiting for a close shot. When it came, a rabbit not more than 20 feet away, he shot carefully and only missed by a hair, actually cutting the fur along the top of the rabbit's shoulders. The rabbit dodged left, then right, and vanished in the underbrush, and Brian went forward to get his arrow. At first he couldn't find it. He'd seen it fly, had seen it exactly where it went into the snow. There was a hole marking the arrow's entry, but it wasn't there. He dug in the snow, but still couldn't find it, and didn't find it until he stepped back and lined up the flight of the arrow and worked along the snow, scooping it out every foot. The arrow had gone more than 30 feet after entering the snow, skittering along beneath the surface before coming to rest. He'd have to be careful of his shots, he thought, pulling it out and blowing the snow off the feathers. He'd lose all his arrows on one hunt. He moved on, still taken by the beauty, and had 3 more shots, all of which he missed because the targets were so small. Rabbits, and he wasn't used to shooting the heavier bow yet. I'll have to get close, he thought. Work right up on them, get into the thicker brush. He slowed his pace even more and moved into a large stand of brambles and thick young evergreens, packed so closely he couldn't see more than 10 feet, and that only by crouching down and looking along the ground. It was hard going. Every limb pulled at the bow, and he had to be careful not to wreck the feathers on the arrows as he moved. There were rabbits everywhere. The snow was covered with their tracks, and he had moved nearly 50 yards into the thick brush when the sound of a breaking limb stopped him cold. Rabbits and foolbirds did not break limbs when they moved. Deer broke limbs. Bear broke limbs. Almost simultaneously, he saw different tracks in the snow in front of him. Big tracks. Huge tracks. The hair went up on his neck. They were big enough for Bear, and what he really didn't want to do in his whole life was meet a bear in thick brush, especially if it was a bear that had a memory of a bad night with a skunk. But when he leaned down to study the tracks, he saw they had a cloven hoof, like those left by a deer, but larger, much larger. Moose! He knew instantly. He had seen moose several times since he had been attacked last summer. Once he had seen a bull with a rack so large that Brian could easily have fit between the antlers. The rest had been cows. They were all unbelievably big, and after he'd been attacked by the cow along the lake, he'd given him a wide berth. When he got angry, it was like having a Buick mad at you. But he thought just that at first. But, he thought, just that at first. But what? But the moose are smaller now? But I'm tougher now? He shook his head, pushed his thoughts away. The sneaky thoughts, the ones that said he was hunting meat for food. Moose were made out of meat. He had a larger bow. Primitive people hunted moose with weapons like his. He was different now. He heard the sound again, a breaking limb, close, maybe 30 yards, and he crouched down and looked along the snow as he had for rabbits. There. A brown leg moving, then another. Like small trees they were, suddenly moving small trees. He held his breath and crouched watching. He could not see more of the moose, just the legs, and as he watched, they moved off to the left a bit, hesitated, then turned left again and started moving slowly, directly at him. Ah, he thought, there it is. Like it or not, I am about to hunt moose. His stomach tightened, and he stood and quickly glanced at his position. The brush was too thick for him to run, even if he had wanted to, and the truth was he didn't want to. He was different. He did have better weapons, and there was a lot of meat on a moose. No room, he thought, to maneuver or to shoot. He moved his head to the right, and all he could see was thick brush. Then to the left, and it was the same. No, there, a small opening, not 4 feet across and about 4 feet off the ground. Almost a tunnel through the brush. But if it all worked right, all worked exactly right, he might be able to get a shot. He moved to the left and stood facing the opening, leaned the killing lance against a nearby bush, held the bow up with the top tipped slightly to the right to keep it out of the brush, and put his best arrow on the string ready to draw, and waited. And waited. Time seemed to stop. Somewhere to his left he heard the soft sound of a bird's wings, then the scratchy sound of a chickadee. Brush cracked directly in front of him, but he could see nothing. Another bird flew past. He aged, waiting, and now he heard the moose stepping, its hoofs shushing, shushing in the snow, and another breaking branch, and then a curved line, as the side of the moose's front end came into view in the tunnel. Brian tensed his fingers, tightening on the string. The edge of the shoulder moved slowly, ever so slowly to the left, bringing more and more of the moose's chest into view. A third there, then a half, then 2/3, and then the whole chest. Brian drew the shaft back. A cow. His brain registered a large cow moose, no antlers. A little spit dripping from the side of her mouth. Brown eyes looking at him, but not seeing him. Or at least he hoped not. 20 feet, no more. 6, 7 paces at the most. He released the bowstring. He could see it all later in his mind's eye, so it all must have registered, but when he did it, everything happened so fast, and yet incredibly slowly, that it all seemed one event. The arrow jumped from the string, and he saw the feathers fly straight away from him and at the moose, and slammed onto the moose's neck just above the center of her chest. And in that instant, in the same split second, the moose caught the movement of the bow and arrow in Brian's head and charged so fast she almost met the arrow. If Brian had expected the brush to slow her down, or the arrow striking her to handicap her, he was sadly mistaken. She was at him like a cat, so fast that she seemed a blur, and yet his mind took it all in. I hit her. The arrow hit her in the neck. She's charging at me. Another arrow. No time. The lance. That's it. The lance. He threw the bow aside and reached for the lance. All in one motion, and all too late, he felt his hand clamp on the shaft of the lance, and at the same time she came out of the brush on top of him. He had one fleeting image of a wall of brown hair with the feathers of the arrows sticking out of the middle, and he went down. He would never know what saved him. She was gigantic and on him, and he thought she would crush him, mash him into the ground. But either the arrow hampered her movement, or her momentum carried her too far, and she went on over Brian and had to turn and come back at him. He was hurt, his leg, his shoulder, yet he could move, and he rolled, still holding the killing lance, and came up to a kneeling position. He raised the head of the lance just as she hit him again. One image. She threw herself at him, her eyes red with rage, and he saw her run onto the lance, the point entering her chest just below the arrow. Then her head hit his forehead. Brian saw one flash of white light, as bright as all the snow, then nothing but pain and darkness. And that is the end of chapter 9. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.